Good morning, warriors. It is April 1st, and today we have a rather difficult task ahead of us. We need to discuss one of the central aspects of the Columbian Exchange. Often, when we talk about the Columbian Exchange, we are thinking about things like the transmission of foods, or animals, or plants, or diseases from one part of the world to another, from Afro-Eurasia to the Americas, or vice versa. But one crucial part of the Columbian Exchange is the movement of people, the movement of ideas, and the movement of institutions. And that means today we need to talk about slavery. Now, we have discussed slavery many times in this class, but today the discussion of slavery takes on a different character because today we need to discuss the development of race-based slavery. So this is not a fun discussion. This is one that I sincerely wish I were in front of you so we could have this conversation together as a class, and so you could stop me and ask questions whenever you felt like you didn't understand something. So today is kind of rough. There's going to be stuff that I'm talking about here that is really distressing. And I just want you to know that you are absolutely welcome to drop me questions or ask for additional source material, or, just pause as you need to, because this isn't easy stuff. History requires that we confront the ugliness of humans as well as their good sides. So the first thing I want to do right here and right now is acknowledge that first and foremost, I'm a white lady teaching you about race-based slavery. And my personal experience and background in terms of education about enslavement of people and about race-based slavery was really limited for a very, very long time. I've done most of my readings on this by myself. I've really tried to educate myself to the best of my ability about this topic because when I was in high school and even when I was in college, I really had to seek out information about this. It wasn't necessarily anything that was just kind of part of the normal way that the discussion of early American history was taught. And that was a shortcoming. So I'm trying not to do the same thing to you guys. So I really want to do today is to try to get behind the deformation of conscience. And what I mean by that is, in order for us to really understand enslavement of people and to understand race-based slavery, or to even sort of try to do that, we have to first try to understand what causes people to think this sort of thing is okay. So that means that what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at a lot of intellectual structures. We're going to be talking about like patterns of thought and justification. The term that I would use in my other class would be ideation. Like what was the pattern of ideas that made people think that race-based slavery was okay. And if this feels like it still has resonance today in terms of structural racism or the experience of colorism, like those are real things that tie back to this concept. So I hope that you just won't like fast forward through this or click through it very quickly. I hope you sit with the idea and kind of wrestle with it. I know it's a tough one. Sometimes things are meant to be tough for us. So here we go. So the first thing I want to say is that remember that while we have been talking about enslavement and slavery practices all the way back to when we talked about agriculture, primarily we've been talking about it in the context of three main types of slavery: debt-based, criminality, and prisoner of war. That was primarily the way that people were enslaved in the pre-modern systems. But the type of slavery we are going to talk about today is distinctly different. Now, it is impossible for us to qualify or quantify people's suffering when they are enslaved. All forms of slavery are exploitative and horrible and a deep personal evil. But the type of slavery that is used particularly between the 1400s and the end of the 19th century, is its own brand of evil. And that type of slavery has a particular name. It's called chattel slavery. That is a term I really want you to understand. So chattel slavery is the notion that a person who is enslaved can be treated as legal movable property. That is, the person in a legal sense ceases to be human. Instead, The person who is enslaved, their body is no longer their own. The person who claims ownership over them claims ownership over their bodies, their labor, and their issue, which is a fancy way of saying their children. In this way, chattel slavery is, by its nature, about seizing ownership over bodies and labor and children themselves. And this means that chattel slavery becomes hereditary because a person doesn't even own their own child, they don't own themselves. There is no conception of that in chattel slavery. If a person is just property, then that property can't have kids. The only people who can have kids are essentially the masters who own those children. Generally speaking, chattel slavery also had no means by which a person could terminate their subjugation, by which what I mean is that there was no term limit to how long you were enslaved. Like debt slavery frequently had a term. Like you were enslaved until you paid off your debt. Or if you were a prisoner of war, sometimes you could earn your freedom after a period of time. There was no natural end to slavery under chattel slavery. And that's what makes this system so radically different from the ones that we have discussed before. So, what we have to do now is kind of draw a line between the types of slavery that we've discussed in the past and the type of slavery that develops in the 1400s, particularly around Western Europe. And this is race-based slavery. Okay, so this is looking at the difference in race as though it is immutable and biological, meaning that it is something that you are born with and cannot change. Which we can discuss that as a concept later, but like that has its own problems. But the notion of race-based slavery is particularly different than what we've talked about in earlier societies. And I mean, even if we go all the way back to classical Greece, excuse me, you have philosophers who discuss slavery. In particular, Aristotle, one of the great philosophers of classical Greece, argued that slavery was not only not evil, but natural and even good, because he said some people were just naturally suited to be free, and some people were naturally not. That there was a hierarchy in humanity, and some people were just naturally better than others. And so, therefore, Aristotle justified his idea of slavery by saying it wasn't really about men subjugating other human beings. It was about, like, people just recognizing the natural hierarchy that already existed. Personally, I think that's a bunch of bunk. I think that's a justification to keep a social order in place that benefited people like Aristotle. And so he was looking for an intellectual reason to justify his power. But generally speaking, the way Aristotle conceived of this was he said that those who were suited to slavery were usually barbarians. That means they were uncivilized by the Greek perspective. And so for the Greeks, that usually meant that slavery had a connotation of foreignness, that those who were enslaved were often foreign. Now, this made sense because often those who were enslaved were prisoners of war, and so they were foreign to whatever city-state or even to Greece itself. Foreign slaves were also desirable because they were marked as different. They were maybe not native Greek speakers. They spoke a different language. Their culture was different. Their clothing was different. And sometimes even their race or ethnicity was different. But it wasn't a preconceived notion that to be a slave you were of one particular race. Instead, what was important for the Greeks was that slaves were marked as somehow socially different and distant from the majority population. So what we see is this idea of slaves being foreign as a foundational idea. And that idea spreads wherever Greek ideas spread. And so it spread into the Roman Empire. And as the Roman Empire expanded into Western Europe and into Northern Africa, those ideas also spread. Okay? So Aristotle and these early classical Greek philosophers do the first major sort of justifying of slavery, if one can ever justify like subjugation of another human being, which I am going to say, no, you can't. Now, so these ideas are in the background, floating around in the ether in these classical writings. And religion is another idea in the background that is sometimes used to justify the practice of slavery. Now, you'll remember that religious texts are not just like in this class, we don't study them just as revealed text in terms of theology. We also think about them as historical documents, things that were created at a particular time in a particular context. And so early writings, like if you are familiar with the Christian Old Testament, very early writings like the Christian Old Testament contain documents and stories that are unique to the time and place in which they were written down. And those stories take place in a world that involved a heavy use of slavery. And often in the Old Testament, you will find references to slavery. It's frequent. And often that slavery is depicted as punishment, that this enslavement is just because the person in question has done something wrong. They have sinned. Okay, and there are certain texts out of the Old Testament and even in the New, in some cases, in Christianity that involve this notion. And in particular, there's a couple of different passages. One involves the murder of Abel by his brother Cain, very, very early on in the Old Testament. And there's this notion that God has marked Cain for his sin, that his sin is somehow visible. And so there's this notion that gets kind of brought into religious practice that sin can be seen in certain social strata, like in particular statuses, that if you were enslaved, perhaps you're enslaved not just because you were captured or you were in debt or you were a criminal, but you are all of those things because you are also sinful, and that this is therefore a rightful punishment sent by God. These ideas spread throughout the Judeo-Christian world, and then they eventually spread into the Quran and into the Islamic world, into Dar al-Islam. These ideas spread because those three religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are related. They all share a common sort of theological grounding. And so they share that common idea about a visible manifestation of sin. So what we start to see is in the Islamic world, starting in the 9th century, moving into the early 900s, you start to see this acceleration of enslavement of populations being tied more and more strongly to the idea of visible sin. And the Islamic world, if you think about where it was centered, if the center of the Islamic world was Mecca, then very close to that region, right across the Red Sea and a little bit further south, you have a population of people who look distinctly different from Arabic and Northern African populations. You have sub-Saharan Africans. These populations were initially primarily animistic or polytheistic, and that was in direct contradiction to the teachings of Islam. And so, therefore, that would have been seen as sinful behavior, and there was a distinct physical difference in terms of skin coloration between Arab peoples and sub-Saharan African peoples. And so what you see is that people in the Islamic world purchased slaves, just like a lot of people in the ancient world did. And there grew to be a preference to purchase sub-Saharan African slaves because there was this notion that it was somehow more morally acceptable to enslave a group of people that was quote unquote sinful than it was to enslave populations who were like yourself. I'm going to pause here because I need to start a new video. I know that this is really controversial stuff, but there is lots and lots of scholarship on it, and I'd be very happy to provide you with the citations if you would so choose.